I'm really excited to be here and talk about this question of MFA, and is your MFA actually broken? And it's not just a rhetorical question. It's a question that we all need to pay attention to, whether we're on the business side or whether we're on the technology side and the identity and access side of things. 57% of global organizations are using MFA today, right? 57%. If you're in a high tech or a tech industry like we are here at Axiad, 87% of those organizations are using MFA today. If you're a large organization up to say 10,000 employees, also 87% are using some form of MFA. In a smaller organization that might be under say 100 people, even then we're looking at 37% or so of those organizations are using MFA. So it's not so much a question of, hey, is everybody on the MFA bandwagon? Are we actually doing MFA and are we making it work? It's now become a question of, is it actually working and working well? Is it doing what we want it to do? And I think the crux of it is, the one takeaway from this part of the presentation is there's lots of different ways to do MFA. In this conversation today, we're going to take about another 20 minutes or so here to talk about how MFA has evolved, and especially how attacks on MFA have evolved. What's different now than it was, say, in 2015 when MFA became really popular and really started surging to the forefront of identity and access management? What adversaries are they actually doing, and what kind of insight can we get from what they do today? Then we're going to take a look at a couple of recommendations. What CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency of the US, and Gartner and NIST, what recommendations do they make on how to mature your MFA, how to make your MFA, say, not make it phishing resistant, make it more robust, and make it more capable to withstand some of these attacks that are occurring. And then I think right between those, we are going to pause. We're going to have a real quick poll just to sort of keep your attention and kind of get us start judging a sense of where your organization fits in this landscape. And then we're going to talk about, how do you actually future-proof MFA? How do you future-proof it without doing a rip and replace on some really expensive systems, whether they're your identity and access systems, your IDP, or other components? We're going to talk about MFA and how MFA, and we all know this, I think anybody that's been in the cybersecurity space for any length of time knows that what we mean by MFA, multi-factor authentication, is knowledge factors, and then possession factors, and then inherence factors, like things things that you have that demonstrate that you are who you say you are, whether it's a credential, whether it's a certificate, whether it's a encrypted key, and then something you are, biometric capabilities. And all of these are a little bit different. But what we've seen is that more and more emphasis is now going to, because of the IGA, the identity and governance part of it, and the identity verification, more and more emphasis is going on to the possession factors, something that you've got, whether that's a certificate, whether that's a FIDO token or credential, like we were just looking at with passkeys with Keeper, or whether it's a hardware token that you might carry. So I'm gonna step back in time real quick and do a fast forward from 2015, when things got really exciting in the multi-factor authentication space. This is when Okta, Duo, Ping became sort of household names in cybersecurity and on the IT stage. This is when Google started doing their own MFA authenticators, and when Windows really started looking at Hello for Business. And then the wheels fell off a little bit. And I mean that in the best possible way. I mean that in the way of, like, how do we evaluate what's happened and use it to inform decisions that we make today? So we're not going to do any breach shaming, as I call it, and talk about like what people did bad, but we are going to talk about what we've seen in the industry. Going back to 2017, so 2 years on, another 20 months or so after sort of the heyday of MFA adoption and the rise of some of those companies, we started to see some vulnerabilities emerge, like in the SS7 routing protocol, that a lot of 2FA and MFA solutions relied on started to get routinely compromised. In fact, there was a long trending story out of banks in Germany, for instance, where this article from Ars Technica comes from, where thieves were effectively stealing, compromising SS7 and using that to really compromise an entire MFA solution. Flash forward a little bit to 2019, the FBI says, wow, now we have multiple examples. We have multiple kits. We have Necrobrowser and Murian kits that are available on the dark web to go ahead and help our adversaries actually compromise MFA solutions or 2FA implementations, or push MFA or push notifications lots of different ways that they can compromise those. We flash forward a little bit more in 2021, and we started to see one-time passcodes, OTPs that we mentioned before, routinely being compromised and being a significant part of what the sort of the adversary toolkit looked like. And then one-time passwords, we saw those adversaries start using bots powered by Telegram and other technologies and tools to basically automate the entire process of compromising a 2FA implementation or situation. So as we can see, this is just what happens as we land on a technology, we start implementing it at scale. Again, if we're talking about globally, 57% of organizations have implemented some kind of MFA. However, we see this sort of maturity of the adversaries. The most recent one that really struck me because of I've done a lot of research around it and a lot of after action analysis on it was what happened with Uber. Uber was really challenged through their MFA, and it's really just sort of an advanced form of social engineering and phishing, where they were trying to get the credentials to actually add the attacker's device into Uber's MFA environment, and really just kind of like, we've called it MFA fatigue or push fatigue, where they've had to accept messages. And in this case, when the adversary was later recounting like how it actually happened, he went into some details about how he just basically hassled the poor IT contractor to death until he added their device, which allowed it to put a credential on it, which allowed it to have access to what Uber was doing. And then also later in 22, we started to see even the strongest of our authentication players like Twilio started to see significant challenges coming into compromising credentials and passwords. So we all know then that passwords are bad for lots of those reasons. The transferability, the fact that that they can be stolen or purchased or just borrowed, en masse. But then there's another element of it as we start looking at kits that are made, and we're going to show one real briefly, the Evil Jinx kit, which is now evolved to version 3.2, really advanced phishing capabilities around how to step into the middle of an MFA session and actually compromise it. Earlier this year in spring, end of spring, there was a message that came out. Federal government also CISO looking at some research that was done by Darktrace that looked at how now using AI and combination of legitimate platforms and AI to compromise MFA, again, using AI to generate a whole series of different messages and doing phishing on a problematic sort of automated scale that's sort of astounding and that our technologies can't really keep up with. It's really important to remember too, when we talk about things like those technology kits or phishing kits or the Evil Jinx kit, it's not super complicated. It is interesting technology. When they get that man in the middle or that device in the middle phishing kit and acquire it and start implementing it has its own tools and scripts for you to identify who your preferred targets are, what route you want to provide the attack information into, and they'll actually just drop the phishing kit, or the adversaries drop the phishing kit where they're going to set up either a fake or a redirected destination. The victim is going to come in and enter credentials. The phishing kit then is going to be responsible for forwarding the credentials and the MFA token, whatever tokens exist with it, to the appropriate site, to the actual site, the destination server. It's going to return a session cookie that's going to manage permissions and authentication for that site. But in the middle of that, of course, it goes to the threat actor. Thanks very much to HelpNet Security for devising this graphic that we borrowed to plug in here. The threat actor gets the session cookie and the credentials and then can do what they want in terms of either then in that session or later when they enable a session, forward the session cookie back to the victim. And they're doing their regular work with that site destination, whether it's a retail site or it's a SaaS service that they're using. However, we've now compromised all of the credentials that work within it, and we can reuse those credentials. And it's not that expensive. And I kind of jest here, end of summer special, but really for about $600, you can buy a pretty well constructed phishing kit like that on the dark web and deploy it to compromise your target of choice, as it were. So it's no longer hard to do. It's not difficult to enable. It's not difficult to deploy. And there's a lot of tools that are out there for it. So today, I want to look just briefly. I want to just thinking about the Olympics that happened, just a couple of weeks ago. It was inspiring every couple, 4 years or so to see kind of what happens to our ability to go, faster, higher, and stronger, the Olympic model. But to keep in mind that that works with our adversaries as well. And when we talk about what's wrong with my current MFA, it's not that it's inherently bad or inherently broken or a bad choice in the initial procurement of it or deployment of it. It's just that our adversaries are going to keep getting stronger and stronger and stronger. They're going to get more efficient. They're going to learn how to compromise. They're going to learn where the weaknesses are in those. And in the previous session with Keeper, we talked about a lot of those compromises. Let's look at what the recommendations are from sort of authoritative sources right now. The White House actually listed the executive order back in 2021 saying, hey, we're going to require organizations to really ramp up their cybersecurity. That was Executive Order 14028. And we're going to leave it to a couple of key agencies. We're going to leave it to the Office of Management and Budget to determine what that's actually going to look like and how that's actually going to get deployed within federal agencies, and then use that as a guideline to also inform other organizations, the organizations that most often do business or work with federal agencies. One of the things, or a key thing that they had sort of landed on and divined, was we need to have phishing-resistant MFA. Phishing-resistant MFA foils that session that we talked about before, because it actually keeps the active session going so that you're not dealing with a credential that can get transferred or handed off. It sort of remains in possession of the session all the time. And it allows dynamic authentication throughout the entire process. This is a notification from CISA, again, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, where they're talking about how do you achieve it? How do you get to phishing-resistant MFA? And they're really saying there's two ways that you can do it. You can use FIDO passkeys or web authentication process, which is part of what FIDO uses, or you can use public key infrastructure, PKI, that we're all kind of used to. That's what TLS, or Transport Layer Certificate, or Transport Layer Security, does, is manage sort of your PKI infrastructure, the certificates that you're binding to either your devices or your sites. The whole point being to push authentication away from the weaker authentication methods, the SMS, voice, app-based MFA, and push it over to something that's credential-based, something that's more of the knowledge factor, or not knowledge, but the inherent factor, something that you actually have during that MFA session. And they made a lot of comments about the suitability of PKI for organizations. But then that gets adopted by a whole bunch. Once that becomes guidance from CISA, that gets adopted by a lot of other organizations. One of those is the Criminal Justice Information System, which is under the aegis of FBI, who manages that, and really the largest criminal justice information system on the planet, in the universe, in terms of storing and enabling information retrieval around previous offenses, fingerprints, identification of previous crimes. Now, the FBI manages CJIS, and they're now not just saying you have to have multi-factor authentication, but you need to have strong multi-factor authentication, and they're pointing specifically to access any of that information. And that's not just law enforcement agencies, that's legal teams on both the defense and prosecutor side, anybody involved in accessing that information. And they're pointing to another NIST document, NIST 800-63B, Digital Identity Guidelines. And it's talking about, like, what do you need to make strong, higher assurance level, the higher assurance level to achieve cryptographic strength within your authentication, really to defeat phishing. And examples of like that Evil Jinx toolkit and what's available, you need to have phishing-resistant MFA. And they define it specifically as having cryptographic protocols on the device or the devices that you're using, as well as credentials that manage the session and the communications. So one more example of how that gets sort of pushed to other agencies, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, actually has a huge umbrella, a very large remit for organizations where they define what's appropriate technology usage. And they're now looking at changing their standards as well. And when they define sort of a standard for multi-factor authentication, they're leaning towards the stronger standards. That has a really broad coverage. That's home ownership, that's loan financing and banking, that's automobile dealerships, servicing agencies, anybody in the alcohol distribution business, anybody in appliances and jewelry. All of those sort of fall under FTC guidance. We're about ready to step into a couple of questions. I've given you a lot of background information. There's more that's out there. we're going to get a couple of poll questions to kind of sense where the audience is and where your current investments are in MFA. I want to point to a couple of other resources. If you're a customer of Gartner, they've done some pretty good research and reports recently. Innovation Insight for Many Flavors of Authentication Token is one of my favorites. And it breaks down, the two analysts that wrote it break down kind of where do you want to use stronger credentials in your authentication for which specific use cases. And they do a good job of saying, hey, really for strong authentication, you want to move away from out-of-bound messaging, OTP, sort of one-time out-of-bound voice or one-time passwords. And you want to start moving towards credential-based. When you move to X509 or move to FIDO-based credentials of some kind. And they do a good job, I should say, of breaking down all of the different use cases, how you put those pieces together and saying, hey, there's a lot of things that we do on our networks, from network and PC login all the way to on the far right side, that column is for consumer identity and access management, managing our customer accounts online. But for the bulk of those, for the things that you want to invest in, where you want to make new investments, is really around X509 credentials and using FIDO, using strong credentials. So we're going to pause there for a second, and we're going to get into some questions before I start talking about, how do you solve for this problem? How do you make strong credentials and then manage those at scale? The question that I have for anybody that can jump in and join it, are you planning on updating or reinforcing your current MFA solution in 2025 or in this upcoming year? You can answer that question and drop into it, just a single click on there. And then another question is, what mechanisms are you looking at to do MFA? Are you looking at FIDO or FIDO2 protocols, X509 or TLS certificates? Or you can also use like number matching protocols through one-time passwords or sort of automated methods for doing one-time passwords. So just give a simple click if you got a minute and you have some thoughts about where you're going with MFA in the future. Let's talk about the best practices for achieving that phishing resistance, the strong MFA. We all know that identity and access management, or IAM, is the foundation for identity and access. But I want to encourage everybody to think about, much as the government is this process now being ICAM, not just IAM, identity, credential, and access management. How do you manage those credentials at scale? How do I manage certificates where they're appropriate? And that can be for your non-browser use cases or direct connection, using RDP, using remote and mobile devices, or you can use passkeys like the FIDO2 passkeys and examples like we saw in the Keeper demonstration. But there'll be a different set of use cases. There'll be a set within the organization that are really appropriate for using X509 or TLS certificates, whether those are user device or organizational. And then there'll be a set of use cases that are really appropriate for using passkeys. And I think understanding the intersection and where those work together is really key to solving that user experience problem. Where can we actually work these together and in conjunction with each other? A lot of the multi-factor authentication that's handled is done through hardware tokens, through hardware authenticators, whether those are from Yubico or IDEMIA, Thales, Phation. If you have any of those hardware-based authenticators, you typically can have one credential management system, one solution that can deploy your credentials, the passkeys as well as X509 credentials, onto those tokens, and you can have multiple uses of them. So you can have PIV authentication for government usage. You can have a X509 authentication on it. And in doing that, you have like one method basically to do strong authentication and one platform that you can manage those credentials across. Or another way that you can do it, a second option, is to use a strong multi-factor authentication, mobile-based authentication with credentials that are embedded in your end user devices. So whether that's this laptop that I'm working on or my phone over here. So I have a combination between the strong authentication that's being done in my mobile multi-factor authentication, as well as a certificate that it's actually checking and allowing in the end user device, whether it's, again, that phone or whether I'm doing it through a different device. So that's another way that you can actually achieve that. Some of the best things to do, and two things to just keep in mind in this entire process when you're trying to achieve phishing resistance: a combination of what we will call certificate-based authentication and FIDO, a way to pull those together and work within your existing ecosystem. How do you get to zero trust? Is you get there by combining those two capabilities. And we look at it as really providing a system that's not another platform that you need to rely on. You, as if you're, and I'm assuming that most of you attendees are, your IT managers, InfoSec experts, solution architects. You don't really need another platform. What you need is a solution that actually enables all of those platforms to work together, an ecosystem. So pulling insights from your IDP, pulling insights from your machine identities, pulling insights from your IGA, your governance solution like SailPoint. At Axiad, all of our customers really have all of these different solutions, and we help them pull all of those inputs together and do credential management, deliver a cloud-based or SaaS-based PKI solution, and then do web authentication in the middle of that process that facilitates that access. And so I won't go through a whole demo, but I'll just grab a real quick screenshot and show you that when you're managing one of those credentials, like in this case, a YubiKey credential, you can have multiple different credentials. A YubiKey authenticator, you can have multiple credentials on it. You can have a FIDO credential on it. You can have a one-time password on it. You can have a TLS certificate or an X509-based certificate on it. And for each one of those, through this sort of central console, you can understand the details of it. You can do revocation of it if necessarily. You can unassign it. You can validate it. You can retrieve the PIN unlock code or the PIN unlock key, what we call the PUC information on it. So it basically abstracts and pulls away all that information to make it accessible and usable for you to do that ICAM, identity, credential, and access management across your entire enterprise and across all your different users. Wanted to point out, if any of the attendees are in the federal government and looking at agencies or departments and looking at solutions they can buy, we've recently gone to the in-process stage of FedRAMP, which means that we're working with our existing sponsor to kind of go through all of the pieces, all of the hoops and everything that you need to go, the technology assessment and the usability assessments to be available in the FedRAMP marketplace. And this will be available probably, well, it's hard to say with the federal government, but we're hoping to have it available by the end of the year. And you can also access through this link on this, a solution brief that we've created, a blueprint effectively for how do I apply this intelligent credential management in an automated way to systems that I already have. And I can't stress enough that it's our basically business philosophy and our approach to this technology that we don't want anybody to have to rip and replace a system. It's finding a way to make your existing investments work together and work harmoniously and deliver the kind of user experience that you need, while also giving you the kind of strength of authentication that you need, the kind of strong authentication that we need to keep up with those adversaries that we mentioned earlier and that we went through. So thank you for those that provided information on that, on the input on the quick poll. Again, we have this resource that's available for use. I want to thank Chrissy and the team at Keeper and everybody at CyberEdge for letting us join in and talk about this passwordless future today. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Michael. And before we wrap up, we did receive some questions from the audience, so I can jump in and ask some for you to answer. The first one comes from Lauren. She asks or states, our employees don't like having more than one user experience for any IT process. Does having multiple credentials just make this worse?
It can, yes, it absolutely can. It's a very good question, Lauren. However, the key to a system like Axiad's Axiad Cloud system is having one workflow process that works for your FIDO credentials that you may be using for sort of external facing websites, as well as your internal credentials, where you're using, say, X509s to manage access onto your network or access onto other systems or SSH keys. It can get complicated if you sort of try to build it and shoestring it together and build it yourself using different credentials. Again, Axiad Cloud is not a platform that supersedes anything else. It's a way to make those workflows sort of blend together. And when you're using Axiad Cloud, you actually get the same user experience, whether you're using PIV or CAC cards, or whether you're using an IDEMIA token or credential or hardware-based authenticator, or any other kind of authentication method. So you do have to be careful with that, but there are methods to streamline that for people.
Great, thank you. Next, John has asked, how many credentials can one hardware token typically carry?
If you're using so it does vary quite a bit. Some of the newer tokens, like again, the IDEMIA tokens that we see quite a bit of our customers are using, or Phishing tokens, they're using in scores, 20s, a number of credentials and tokens. And this is important because especially IT administrators are using they're accessing a lot of different systems. And to provide that kind of sort of strong authentication into all those, you might have examples where an IT administrator or somebody that's managing infrastructure, an infrastructure owner, might have 20, 30 credentials on their single token. Most of your average knowledge worker users might have, though, just 2 or 3 tokens on that. But it is important to think about your sort of the architecture of your overall system and getting engaged with credentials or hardware manufacturer providers that have that kind of flexibility to do multiple credentials that then you can manage through a system like Axiad Cloud.
Perfect. And this will be our last question, comes from Ryan, and he asks, does an enterprise-wide ICAM just shift the cost of identity and access to the buying and managing of credentials? And how does this affect users and devices?
This is a really good question, Ryan. So one of the challenges, the perpetual challenges with doing X509-based authentication and assurance of any kind, is that obviously the certificates have a cost. There's a different cost for each device certificate, different cost for a business or site or user certificate. So there can be cost in those. I think the important thing and the smart thing to do is look at sort of, again, architecturally and organizational wide, what is the overall cost going to look like? I think that that Jonathan and Adrian brought up a really good data point earlier where like the cost of a password reset's about $70. Well, interestingly, the cost of a really advanced hardware token, and even if you're not buying thousands of them, is also about $75. With that, and with systems that sort of automate the public key infrastructure and provide private keys for you and provide that infrastructure, I think you can have a really cost-effective way to manage many, many, many users against the plethora of devices that we see today. It used to be that identity management was like identity management of humans and machines was about a 1-to-1 and then 1-to-2 ratio. And now we're looking at something like for every 1 employee, you might have 10 physical devices that need to have authentication or an authentication method into it, which might include having a certificate or a passkey of some kind that's available. And then again, for IT people and people that are deploying infrastructure, there's no limit. There could be literally thousands of cloud-based instances that need to have an authentication, certificate applied to it. So I didn't answer your question directly, Ryan, about the cost, but I think it's comparable to when you look end to end, the whole lifecycle management of identities, getting rid of or minimizing that password reset cost with some things that are scalable and that you can automate and that you can forecast what the cost is going to be by combining, in sort of spreading the footprint around your hardware-based authenticators and the credential management that sits on those.
Thank you, Michael. I think that's everything from our audience. So I think we will conclude today's webinar.